All right, and welcome back to another episode of Who's Lifting Today. We're going to be talking about should you have weigh-ins as part of your strength training journey. Now, for those of you who are longtime listeners, I've actually covered this before years ago, where I kind of talked about how the weight on the scale doesn't have like a ton of value and that you shouldn't include it pretty much under all circumstances. That was probably one of my first episodes. The reason I'm doing this again is because as the years have gone on, my opinion has changed a little bit, or it's become a little bit more nuanced than it was before. So if you're a longtime listener and you've listened to that episode, some of this is going to be repeating, but there are changes that I've made, and I think it's important to talk about those changes because as my opinions change, I want them to be updated for the podcast so that you have the most up-to-date information and just clearly know what my thoughts are, as opposed to like maybe some of the older episodes about this that were probably outdated. And I want to talk more about that on how that's changed over time. Now, as like a big disclaimer, I am a weight neutral trainer. I don't ask the weight of any of the people that I work with ever. The only exception being if they are in a weight class sport, which unfortunately we kind of have to talk about it because what they weigh matters a ton for their sport, and it is incredibly relevant. But I'm going to talk about, for you, should you have weigh-ins? Should you be focusing on the weight on the scale in your journey, or is it better for you not to have that at all? And so that's what we're going to talk about today, some things to consider. And at the end of the episode, I'm going to put people kind of in like three categories on if they should use the weight on the scale or not, and have weigh-ins as part of their journey. The first thing I want to ask for you to figure this out for yourself is, what does the scale mean to you? One thing that I've noticed is that the scale represents something for a lot of people, and what that represents is a little bit different. So for some people, it like truly measures their self-worth, like not even about health, not even about their physique, but that number really dictates their value as a human being, which is incredibly problematic because you are much more than your weight on the scale. And one thing I want to mention as well is that like how much you weigh is actually like kind of boring. We put a lot of emphasis on this number, but it doesn't actually tell me that much about you. It doesn't come up much in your life. Like your number being displayed at work probably isn't a thing. It doesn't tell me about your like hobbies, doesn't tell me what your training goals are, or like what your training goals even should be. I would need to know much more information than that. And we could probably figure out that without using the weight on the scale. It doesn't tell me anything about like your personality, your hopes and dreams, your life accomplishments. It doesn't even tell me much about like really your habits in general, which I think sometimes we try to use the weight on the scale to dictate like what your exercise and eating habits are. I've worked with a lot of people over the years, like hundreds of people online, one-on-one at this point. What you weigh did not correlate at all with like your eating habits or how dedicated you were to health. Lightest person, and I don't ask my clients their weight, so I'm kind of guessing here, but I probably work with people who are like sub 100 pounds, and I've worked with people who are like over 400 pounds, and there was no correlation between like the people who were larger were like this committed to health or cared this much or anything along those lines. I think we use this number as like a proxy for that a lot of the time, but I think that that's pretty incorrect. And at a minimum, there's actually like a lot of variance there. So we need to stop doing that because how much you weigh doesn't actually tell us that much. And I've worked with people online for 4 years now. Strength training, their weight, if I did know it, didn't really matter. And not knowing it didn't really change much about the program. So I think like that's, how much you weigh is actually kind of boring. So we're going to talk about it for this episode, but like its value is less than I think we might think it is. For some people, the weight on the scale means, it's a measure of health. It's a measure of like, oh, I'm on the right track. I'm doing the right things. I'm probably healthier because I lost this much weight, or my number is below this number, or whatever it might be. For those people who aren't sure if the weight on the scale means health for you, this is the question that I would ask. I would ask, like, if your weight increased by 40 pounds. So like, let's say you were at 140, now you're at 180. But that weight increase made you healthier. would you be okay with that? For the people who are weight focused, that's usually fine. That's usually the case. For the people who there's something more there, that weight gain is uncomfortable, even if you knew it would increase your health outcomes. So that's something to consider as well if you're not sure it's about health. And for some people, it's their primary focus. It's like the number one reason they're training. It's the number one reason they are eating certain ways, or, it's the true motivator of like all of their habits. And for other people, it's secondary. For other people, it's like, I really want to get stronger and healthier. If that results in some kind of weight loss or body composition, then great. But if not, not a big deal. So it's more secondary, or it'd be more like a bonus. And we're going to kind of talk about those people as well. I want to give a little bit of clarification here on that. Like, regardless of where you put this value, it should not be all of your value. It should not be the people who focus on just on the weight on the scale and have no other goals. It's incredibly draining. It's incredibly emotional. Your scale dictates your worth as it goes up and down. It dictates how you feel about yourself as a person. And that's pretty bad, because you as a person are much more than that. And I don't want, your daily or weekly weigh-in to dictate how you feel about yourself, because at a minimum, regardless of how you feel about yourself, it should be dictated by a number that fluctuates, a number that you don't always have control over. If you are in that position, I think that you need to really reassess how you see the weight on the scale and change that focus. And there are some people that I've noticed as well who their primary focus is weight loss, or they don't say it is, but it actually is. And how I can figure this out is that if they're getting stronger, if they're getting healthier, and then the weight in the scale goes up, they feel like a failure across the board. And so sometimes it's like, yeah, you have other goals, but the weight in the scale is really the one that mattered. I think for those people, I understand where you're coming from. I have been that person before. I've worked with people who are that person before. It's important that you reevaluate how much how much the weight matters to you. Because for people who are 100% focused on the weight in the scale and nothing else, and it dictates all of their life habits, it's a dark place. It's a really emotional journey. You are more than that. Your value as a person is more than that. And I hope that you can know that. And if you don't, then I think that there's some work that needs to go there, because that is an unsustainable journey. I have seen people who 30s, 40s, 50s, it's the number one thing they care about. It dictates all their life habits. It takes a lot of time away from you. It takes a lot of life away from you. So even if you care about the weight on the scale, I would encourage you to look into valuing other things as well and working on that process. Easier said than done, for sure. I'm not saying tomorrow you're not going to care, but it is something to look into for sure. So I'm going to give hard no's and hard yeses to people who either don't need to look at the weight of the scale at all, or definitely do. So let's start with the people who definitely do. So the number one that I thought of was weight class athletes. So I used to be a powerlifter, did that for 2 years or so. I needed to know what I weighed because it was important to the sport that I was competing in. I was in the 74 kilo weight class at the time. If I weighed in, actually this happened to me. If I weighed in at 74.1, I would be put in the 83 kilo weight class and would get destroyed because everyone had 20 pounds on me, which actually happened in my first powerlifting meet where I didn't know exactly where my weight was. I decided not to focus on that, and I ended up moving up a weight class unintentionally, and I was crushed by all the other competitors. So for people who are in weight class sports, you kind of have to know because it's necessary for your sport. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Also, there are athletic sports that if you are competitive, your weight does kind of dictate your success in that sport. So an example of this are things like gymnasts. Examples of this are things even very competitive endurance athletes, where putting on weight is a huge disadvantage. And knowing what your weight is and knowing if it's appropriate actually does kind of matter for the success of your sport. So for the most part, when I say hard yeses, these are people who are in very competitive environments, who are not 100% focused on health, and need to know, because being 10 pounds heavier as like an ultra endurance athlete, regardless of how healthy or strong or athletic you are, does make a difference at like the top level. So that's, those people, they need to know. Same again with like powerlifters, where like, again, like when I weighed 74.1 kilos for that competition, that was a huge difference between me like placing in that competition and like literally being last by a lot because I messed up my weigh in. Okay, so those are like the hard yeses that I could think of. There might be more, but those are the ones that I could think of. Hard no is people with current eating disordered behavior. So if you have disordered eating, or you were like somewhere on that scale, and like I mentioned before, the weight on the scale 100% dictates your self-worth, I would remove it altogether. Like it's truthfully just like not worth it. You need to reprioritize what values to you. And if that's something you're working on, if there's like disordered behavior that you're trying to fix or minimize, the weight on the scale will only drag you down with basically no benefit. So those people so if you've been like diagnosed with like eating disordered behavior, or you were somewhere in that world, because it is kind of a spectrum, I would remove the scale altogether, because I don't think it's going to benefit you at all. And I've seen it where people will try and use it on occasion who are in this category, who it ends up just like totally ruining their lives. So that's something to keep in mind. Hard no for those people. Now, in general, we're going to, that's kind of the first category of people that we're talking about. Like if the weight on the scale is all that matters to you, you need a break, at least temporarily. For some people, it's going to be forever. You don't, if the weight on the scale dictates how you see yourself as a person in full, you need to remove it. Get out of your house, like put it somewhere you forget, and if you're like, what if I need it? It's like, you can always buy a new one if you need it. But for now, we need to move on. We need to focus on something else. We have to change that, because what you weigh is at best like one of many things that defines you, and at worst like doesn't define you at all. Or you can flip those best and worst depending on how you see it. Okay, so those are like the hard no people. If the weight on the scale matters, but it isn't everything, and I want you to be like very honest with yourself, because for some people they'll mention other things, but it's truly the one that matters. So if it is the one of like, let's say 3 or 4 things that matters to you in your training, I would put this as like kind of like a maybe. If you find that the weight on the scale takes away from your other successes, then I would still remove it. But if the weight on the scale, as it goes up or down, you can still look at your other successes as like, yeah, but I can do pull-ups now, or deadlift my body weight, or I feel stronger, or I feel better. Then you can probably have it as part of your strength training. But if it takes away, then no. So this group is like kind of a maybe, is that if it matters to you, but it isn't everything, I would put you as like a maybe. You could have it, maybe you don't, and then going from there. Now, this is the third category, and I think this should be the long-term goal for most people. If it doesn't matter to you at all, then it's your call. So if it's one of those things where like, it's a number, I can take it or leave it. It doesn't have a huge value to me. It's kind of no big deal. I think it's totally fine if you weigh yourself or don't weigh yourself, because it's not deciding who you are as a person. I like to think that's where I have gotten to in my life. This was not like a short-term thing. I think at one point it mattered a ton, and then I got rid of it. And then it still doesn't matter to me now at this point. But I'm more comfortable. I now know my weight, and it didn't destroy me, and I feel good about myself, and it's still like not the focus of my training. So I think that should be the ideal scenario. Some people won't get there, and that's okay. But if you can get there, I think the long-term goal should be not that you never see your number or never know what it is, because it might, ruin your day or ruin your life, is that you should be able to know what the number is, and that your value as a human being doesn't change. Because there are unfortunately times where like your weight will probably come up. An example of this might be you're at the doctor's office, even if you don't want them to check your weight. Some do, some don't. I actually went to the doctor and I asked not to get weighed, and they did it anyways, as like kind of an example. Now that's bad. That's like a whole other topic, but that does come up. the second one is that there are medications that are weight dependent. So depending on like what you're taking, it actually isn't essential to your health to properly prescribe you the right medication to know what your weight is, as kind of an example. So again, we don't want the weight to define you, but there are scenarios where weight matters for your health, no matter how weight neutral we are. And so I think the goal should be not to never know what your weight is, but to be okay with the number regardless of what it is. I think that should be the long-term goal. Again, and get as close to that as we can. And the closer you get to that goal, the better, because we don't want the number to define you, either defining you by I can never see it or defining you by it's all that matters. We want it to be almost like an irrelevant number, or as little value as possible is like what I would say. So I'm glad I've done this episode, because this was not the vibe that I gave for the first episode that came out. Probably will get rid of that old episode, because at the time I was very much like, there's a hard no. Very like, no one should do it across the board. As the years have gone on, I'm still very weight neutral. I still don't care what you weigh. I still think it's incredibly boring, but it's something that I think is like, as my opinions are updated, I want to do episodes on that to keep you guys up to date and let you know, how it's changed and why it's changed, and kind of going from there. So anyways, let me know if you have any questions about this. Maybe you're not sure which category you're in. I'll put my email down below. I'll put my social medias. You can send me a message. We can go from there. But otherwise, thanks for listening to another episode of Who's Lifting Today.